Well, I'll talk to you guys while you're jamming pizza. Pizza's pretty good. Yeah, my name's Benedict. I work for WSU Extension. I'm based in the Bellingham office. And my kind of drive in being hired was to work on things, all things plants, and specifically along the lines of horticultural crops. But I've placed some pressure to the powers to be to really allow us to work more on the feed end of production, and that's been really welcomed. And I've been in this position for about a year and a half now, almost 2 years. And we're gonna. One thing I want to mention is that we've gotten a nice regional team of people together at WSU to work on, feed for livestock production, and we're bringing in, we folks like Steve Jones that are involved, and a couple other people on the east side of the state that are now offering some resources and research to the west side of the state. So it's pretty cool. So Nicole asked me to talk about crop rotation and also include cover cropping in that. And so I'll kind of divide that equally throughout the course of this. Again, I'll start off by talking about crop rotation, then get into cover cropping. And then I'm going to spend probably 10 minutes going over some emerging research issues that we've been working on. And I think this is kind of I'd actually just like to spend most of the time talking about that, but a lot of it's in its preliminary phase, and I think that will be interesting to talk about maybe a year or so from now. But a lot of what I'm highlighting here dovetails very well into these two different topics, okay? And we'll get going. And what I like to always do is lay out real sort of first and front how much of this talk is going to be about principles and theory and how much of it is going to be about practices. And for the most part, because there's not a whole lot of real practical research on crop rotation, particularly for dairy production in Western, relative to Western, specifically to Western Washington, this is going to be fairly heavy on the principles and theory end. So what I'm going to ask you is to try to digest that and turn it into make it applicable for each and every one of your own operations. I'll try to do my best at that, but as Nicole mentioned, please just stop me at a point in time and we'll hammer out questions if you don't understand things. I've got a fair bit of data in here, a lot of number of graphs, and I know sometimes I can breeze over things with that. Sound good? Cool. Okay, just to throw out a definition, just so we're all kind of on the same page, and I think this is pretty straightforward, but I want to get it out first and foremost. When I talk about crop rotations, I'm talking about a planned sequence of crops grown in the same field in the same field over time. But more specifically, there are a number of different attributes that we got to look at, and one of which is that these crops have different temporal, so time, and this could include planting date, time period when they're in the field, or length of time. So we could talk about 30 days versus 180 days or 360 days. And then different spatial needs. Obviously, something like corn is going to require different spatial needs than newly seeded pasture. And cultural needs, and this is kind of a catch-all group when we start talking about that, is all the care that goes along with that plant, whether it's tillage, primary tillage, secondary tillage, seeding, mowing. This is separate from pest management, where you talk about herbicide application, maybe insecticide application, etc. But that's where the rubber hits the road when we look at these two different aspects, temporal and the cultural needs, because that's where we can really start creating highly refined systems that can benefit each other, particularly over time. Any questions on this? Okay. Make it even more confusing. I want to make a division in the road at this point between crop or rotational planning and crop sequencing, okay? When we talk about rotational planning, we're usually putting things into groups, and then we rotate between those groups. An example, a warm season crop, something that's planted in the spring, harvested by the fall time, versus a cool season crop that may be planted in the fall, harvested the spring or the fall or summer. As compared to talking about sequencing very specific types of crops, but also down to the varietal level. And that's really what is becoming, to me, is much more important to look at that level. When we start talking about cover crops, we have found more and more that there is a huge amount of difference in varieties of different types of cover crops. And I'll talk a little bit about that later on, just through an example. So just again, rotation planning. When we think of crop rotation, that's grouping of things and then placing them in and after each other in some sort of repeating fashion. Whereas crop sequencing is talking about growing alba barley after silage corn variety. Okay, makes sense? Okay, so just some basics, just so we're kind of all on the same page. When we talk about effective rotations, they first and foremost have to maintain or improve profitability. Okay. I should step back first and make a mention. I should have mentioned this earlier. I realize how restrictive rotations are currently in dairy production in Whatcom County. There's not a lot of diversity. But there also is something else to factor in, is that rotation in and out of dairy production into other horticultural crops. So just something to keep in mind. Maintain and improve profitability, obviously this is the end-all be-all. Things aren't going to work otherwise. Increasing crop diversity, and those are going back to some of those things I was talking with temporal and spatial and cultural needs of those different crops. Obviously, those rotations are going to be benefited from just those changes over time. And then consists of crops with diverse nutrient requirements, and I'll specifically talk about that here in a little bit. But this is important for maximizing any sort of input that you may be utilizing, or in the case of overall nutrient management. Maintaining healthy soil, and this is obviously a giant box of things that we could talk about. But generally speaking, looking at good physical, chemical, and biological soil indices, and that is obviously going to be important to maintain an effective rotation, right? But also, and I mentioned this earlier, that we really create or utilize temporal or spatially diverse niches. So time and space, okay? So when we start thinking about one crop type followed by another, how do they differ in when they're planted? How do they differ in how they're planted? How are they different in how they are managed, okay? All of those components packaged together. And then lastly, reduce off-farm inputs. I'll get into this more specifically, but when we talk about things such as nutrient management, things such as pest management, obviously there's some what we refer to as credits within a rotation that one stage of that rotation can benefit the next, and I'll talk a little bit more specifically about that. But even more specifically is, how does a well-functioning rotation benefit a dairy farm? It should meet the feed needs of the operation. We're talking about crop production here. We're talking about eventually feeding that to animals, and so that is the first and foremost component. These crops should be well adapted to the soils and climate. Clearly, we can look elsewhere and identify a really highly productive cropping system or rotation, and it may just not work in Western Washington. We all know the restrictions that surround that. But also, more specifically, even within a farm, how variations in soil across available land, factoring that in is going to be really important. Okay. Okay, and one of the big ones is effectively utilizing nutrients from manure. This is not only in quantity but in quality, right? And so, and most particularly in timing. When are those pulses and nutrients going to become available, and how can we match those with the demands that the crops are going to be needed, and how can we sequence those with particular manure applications? And one of the big ones that I think a lot of people overlook or just create themselves a giant headache is the labor. Might be a fairly particular sequence of crops that can be constructed, but the harvest or the seeding of one crop is at the same time as the harvest or seeding of another. And clearly that is just a giant headache, or it can cost more in labor. And this is can put a lot of pressure on a farm. So also just throwing this out, minimize pesticide use through integrated pest management practices. I'll show some specific tools of doing that coming up here in a couple slides. And then lastly, minimize soil erosion. Obviously, this is a temporal thing. It depends on what time of year you're talking about, but we can mitigate that and through proper planning, really. Any questions at this point? You guys want to go get more pizza? No? Okay. Okay. So still going through some principles here, I want to start by looking at some essential components, particularly of a crop rotation and particularly how it relates to any livestock operation. But if we look at these and we start talking about the essential components within a rotation, first and foremost is to estimate the feed requirements, what is needed. And there are fairly number of, there's some options available to try to meet those needs. But to estimate that production of that crop rotation, you've got to look at the actual production capabilities, not what's produced in some publication that was produced even in Western Washington, but what's going to happen on a single field that you have historical knowledge of. And so that's really bringing that to reality. Adjusting the ration to rotation, and that what you may find is that ideally that if I make some tweaks in my rotation I may have to make changes in my ration. And I would flip that on its side. Can we adjust the rotation to meet the ration? And we'll talk a little bit more about that when we talk about flexibility. But how meeting those needs and constructing that in such a way that particular crop sequences in such a way so that it can maximize and meet the demands of that ration. Obviously, matching crops to soil. This is a big one. We have some changes in soil type in this county, not major, but there are lighter and heavier soils, and obviously getting those rotations in and out of those meeting those specific restrictions with particular crops is really going to be important, and obviously that can be a major stopping gap, a hurdle to try to come. If you want to boost your corn production, let's say, and you know that you can't get into some ground early enough, or get into it early enough in the fall for harvest. Credit for rotations. This one, I scoured a lot of the literature and tried to look at what really is applicable here, and unfortunately, there's not a whole lot of information. But the reality is that you will hear time and time again that crop rotations bring about benefits from one crop to another. And I think it's kind of a mixed bag, and I'll bring up some examples of that. But there is some bump. Obviously, pulling a field out of pasture and putting it into corn, you're going to get a year or two where you're going to get a little bit maybe better yields, and because you've got some residual nutrients sitting in that soil that you can then access. But that, of course, is can go down in time. Flexibility. This one's rather difficult to describe, but essentially, what we're looking at there is there a way to create some flexibility in the production system? And I'll bring up some concrete examples when we start talking about emerging research. I think we're working on something right now at WSU that I think will really help out with this in terms of offering some flexibility in rotation. Any questions at this point, comments? Okay, so on the flip side of that is usually people start to think about trying to make some changes in their overall rotation scheme to overcome a specific issue. And one of the big ones is obviously pest pressure. Dealing with a perennial weed issue. It's great to get that into that ground into pasture and to be able to manage that over the course of time. That's one example. We could think of a number. Forage quality, pasture decline in productivity and quality over time, age, pulling that out of pasture, maybe getting into corn. Dealing with these simple issues through simple changes. Efficient nitrogen use. What we're talking about here is trying to follow and meet the pulses of demand of one crop with maybe the seasonal changes, the seasonal availability that may occur by sequencing it with another one. And I'll give you an example here, I think, on the next slide. Inconsistent corn performance. Maybe it's time to just simply pull that ground out of corn if you can, or try something that can rebuild that ration through another crop. Feed shortages. If at the point in time where you're dealing with this, it's you're already behind the 8 ball. You're not even making a crop rotation change that year. It's not going to make that issue go away right then and there. But it is indicative of potentially some issues that you're dealing with and the lack thereof of proper sequencing or crop choice for that matter. Okay, so I kind of laid a framework around where I'm going to go for the rest of the crop rotation component. And now I'm going to try to get into some specific examples and try to utilize, maybe some research data to support it. And again, a lot of this is principle and theory. You need to extrapolate that out of there and digest it. And each and every one of you are going to apply it in different ways. Okay, so we can take time through a lot of this. Obviously, nitrogen demand, and I'm just using this as an example, nutrient demand pulses and changes throughout the course of the year. And obviously, during warmer periods of the year, that's going to look a lot different than during cooler times of the year. But the important thing is to try to match the demand of the demand of individual crops or varieties within that rotation, the demands of those with the overall what's going on in that field in the bigger picture. And in this case, we're talking about nitrogen demand. Obviously, when we switch between corn and wheat, their nitrogen demands are vastly different. So the sequencing those two, although albeit fairly complicated, is important. Okay. And you want to match the pulses of the in this case nitrogen in the system to the high demand crops. In case we can talk about corn, obviously that one of those big pulses is going to be in and around in that late June, early July time period. So matching that, and I'll talk a little bit more specifically about that when we get into cover crops. Any questions on that? No. Good food coma going on, right? Nice. Okay, I wanted to highlight, this is unfortunately a really unknown activity or research project that's going on for about a decade down at WC Puyallup. And I'm just going to highlight a component of it, but it's a really interesting project that Craig Cogger's been running since 2003. And hopefully I think he'll probably bring this up in a different light when he comes up to talk in a couple months. But just to walk you through this, I'm not going to spend a lot of time on the detail. It consists of essentially 3 different components: cover crops, amendments, and tillage. Okay, the cover crops include a relay, like an interseeding of ryegrass, but in this case is in horticultural crops. A post-plant cover crop, which I'll show you on the next slide. It's rye and vetch, and then a short-term pasture. And I wanted to use this example for that component specifically and talk a little bit about that impact that it has on particularly soil indices. Okay. On top of that, they've also got a low carbon, in this case, which is dairy manure derived compost, and a high carbon, and then compared to a low carbon, which is a poultry manure derived product. Okay. And so they've compared those two, and this has been going on for a decade, so it's pretty great. And then there's 2 different types of tillage mechanisms. Okay? Does that make sense? You're just looking at a map of all the replicated plots there. And again, we've got a relay planted legume, so that gets interseeded into the cash crop. But we've also got a post-harvest cereal and legume mix. It's a 50-50 blend of hairy vetch and common rye. And that ground is post-harvest, tilled up, reseeded. So there's no fall tillage in this treatment. And then there's a short grass legume mix pasture, and these are small, so they had to manage these with animals that were relatively easy to move around, so they utilized sheep and pastured poultry. But these initially lasted 2 years, and now they're lengthening to 3 and 4 years, okay, because they realize they're starting to see benefits much over a longer time period, which I'll show you here in a minute. But purpose of this is to really highlight the pasture component. These folks are, this group is looking at a million different aspects, and I think Craig obviously is the leader of this, and he's a soil scientist, so there's a lot of soil components. But we also look at weed biology and ecology, obviously yield and whatnot. And it's gone into wheat every 3 years now. So one of the things that is mentioned, and I'm just going to I just randomly pulled out an example just to show you guys the impact that rotation has on some soil indicators. When we look at bulk density, it's an indicator of porosity and compaction, but it also can be an indicator of organic matter content, okay? Because that obviously plays a role in all of that. And one of the things that's been done over the course of the past, since 2004, is measurement of bulk density. So I'm going to take a moment with this, and what we're looking at here is we've got the 3 different cover crop treatments, okay? And we've got the lay, which is the short-term pasture. We've got the post-harvest, which is kind of in this bluish green. That's tilled plant cover crop, okay? And then we've got the relay, which is interseeding, okay? And what we're looking at is the bulk density levels. And essentially, the lower the bulk density, essentially the better. But there's a number of different factors going on there. One of the things that is playing into these 2 different systems is that you've got these amendments going on, right? You've got these inputs. Obviously, they're not putting amendments on top of the pasture. That wouldn't make any much sense. So you've got these high organic matter components being dumped in annually. And what we see is these spikes in bulk density. And what they represent are the time periods when that ground is in pasture, okay? So, an example, 2004, pasture is put in place. It's in pasture, comes out of pasture. Goes in pasture, spends 2 years, bulk density goes back up. Spike out of pasture. And then we go into 3 years of pasture, and we start to see this incline, and then in the 3rd year, a rapid drop in the overall bulk density in that system. So what's going on here? What's that saying? One is tillage has a massive temporary impact on bulk density. It dramatically drops it. When you till things, you fluff it up, okay? And particularly they're using a spader in this case, so it's really fluffing things up. Additionally, those organic amendments into that system put a spike of organic matter and dramatically drop down the bulk density in that system. But what's most interesting to me is that it took 3 years to get the bulk density. This is all pasture, okay? To get that bulk density back down to meeting those organic amendment levels. Does everyone see that? You guys can shake your head no if you don't. Okay, yeah, Chris.
You might want to point out high bulk density is bad.
Yeah, I said that.
And the organics that we're putting on with our manure system, we're seeing a low bulk density to start with. So it's comparable to manure and no manure.
Yeah, and what my underlying point here is that and what they're realizing down there is that for this particular indices, there's a million other things to look at. I just randomly picked one out. Was that there's a maturity factor that happens with pastures. You get that better drainage, that lower bulk density, that lower compacted level. But in the case down in Puyallup, it takes 3 years. Okay, just wanted to bring that up to effect.
You know what depth they're testing?
Yes, this is done to. It's down to I think 12 inches. Yep.
What kind of tillage implements do they use?
You got 2. They've got there's a spader, which is I don't know if you've ever seen one of those. It digs deep, like this, and that's the primary and secondary tillage for that system. The other one is a conventional system that's mowable, plowed, and then disked. And in some years, you have to rototill it too on top of that.
You mentioned the futility or pointlessness of putting amendments on a pasture.
At the levels that they're talking about.
Okay, they're also talking, what are the levels that they're talking about?
You know, I don't know off the top of my head, Chuck. I should know that.
Right.
But it's significant enough that it would essentially take all the available light away from the pasture in that time period. And what they're seeing is these are dry materials.
But if you were to put them on
Injected.
after the grazing season or before the grazing season, I mean, worms can do a lot of incorporation of these materials too.
Sure.
A lot. So that's worth considering.
Sure.
Just to say that, you know.
To be honest with you, I had no influence on that decision.
Right.
I assumed that the
and then, like I
soils.
say, the amount of material that they might be using. I just know that I've seen some dairies around here that made some very significant solid applications
On top
through
of pasture.
winter periods on top of grass, green chopped fields. And you could go out within a month or two,
And
not see a trace, not see anything on that.
It's good to hear.
So
Call Craig out on that one.
well, yeah, but I'm just saying I don't want to.
I'll kick the can down
You
the
know,
road.
I don't think that I.
The point being is I want to talk about the maturity of that pasture. It took time, but it came back down to the same exact levels, as we can see here. Okay, let's switch gears. Let's talk a little bit about weeds. I think this is probably the most relevant benefit that we see from crop rotations, yeah, so I'll spend a couple slides talking about this, and I'm using non-local examples for a point because I think these studies bring out and really put forth in your face what the benefits that specific crop rotations have. This is some work that was published a couple years ago out of North Dakota, and they're looking at the comparison of a cool season and a warm season cropping system. Okay. In that case, it's corn and wheat, okay? And they compared simply a field that had one cool season followed by one warm season crop, okay? And then it just altered between that over the course of time. Compare that to one cool season crop followed by two warm season cropping systems, okay? So there's no wheat in that second year. It was wheat, corn, okay? Versus two cool season versus one warm season. So 2 wheats, 1 corn, okay, over the course of 3 years. 2 cool seasons followed by two warm seasons. So we've got cool, two wheats, two corns, okay? Does that make sense to everyone? And what they found is that they were looking at overall weed density. So these are the amount of emerged weeds in those fields, okay? And what they found is that when a cool season was altered with a warm season, they saw significantly higher weed pressure as compared to when a cool season was followed by two warm season crops, or vice versa. 2 cool season crops were followed by 1 warm season crop. On top of that, those were significantly higher when 2 cool season crops were followed by 2 warm season crops. I want to step back to that initial comment I made at pretty much the second slide when we start talking about crop rotations and temporal differences, temporal needs. And I group things by the time of year that they're grown. And what this is saying is that if you simply alter between a cool and a warm season crop, you're not doing yourself any benefit than if you are to mix it up essentially, okay, by either placing 1 cool season and then following by 2 warm season crops, okay? The idea being there is we start to shift the domination of that population, that weed population, the overall weed population, away from a very few number of weeds and start shifting it towards those very few, far fewer, but those that are less adapted to that changing in the system. Does that make sense to everyone? Okay. I'm going to hammer that home here. Go ahead.
I looked this morning, it's 17 below in Fargo. We're all cold here.
Yeah.
Don't even deal with heat.
Yeah.
We have no heat. This is as relevant to us as saying we're movie stars.
Not true. And I'll give you a concrete example. Okay, winter annuals versus summer annuals. That's literally what we're talking about here. Okay, we're talking about shifting the domination in a cool, warm season crop. You're going to have a balance between those two. Okay, if we were to go to all cool season, we'd have all winter annuals. If we go to all warm season crop, we'd have all summer annuals. And all we're doing is we're mixing up the system so that no one of them can dominate. And we then thus draw down the overall pressure. It's not about temperature. It's about dealing with local issues and altering them so that the environment in which they're trying to survive is inhospitable, essentially. So let me switch that a little bit. Does that make sense? I realize it's really cold in Fargo. So switching gears, looking at the other side of that temporal coin, so to speak, is the fact that we can also look at length of time of a crop. So we can look at time when a crop is in place, but also the length of time. Okay? And I think this does a fantastic job looking at how it influences, particularly, we were looking at a number of different all weed species in that field. Now we're looking at just one, wild oat. Okay? And it's highly evolved to become mature pretty much when most small grains become mature. What we're looking at here is, over the course of time, changes in the wild oat population in 3 different barley production systems. Okay, we've got one that is taken to grain. That's the black line with the black squares. We've got the middle one, which is the normal silage. And what do we mean by that? That is taken at the soft dough stage. So that barley's cut before heading out. And then we've got an early silage, and that is just after head emergence. Okay. So this crop is allowed to mature for a much longer time period than this one, and vice versa for this one. And what we can see is that because this particular weed species has evolved alongside this production system, its population can build up over time. Whereas these, because we're coming in and chopping that off before that wild oat has been able to shed its seed, its populations essentially maintain itself or decline over time. So you see the difference between that example and the one I just previously brought up. We're talking about changing, in terms of crop rotation, we're still in crop rotation here, changing crop rotation in terms of the time in the year that crop is grown, but also the length of that crop, okay? Everyone all right with that? More Mountain Dew, maybe? Okay. Okay, so there was a great paper published in the late 1990s by a fantastic weed scientist, and what they did is they scoured through all the research that had happened prior and found, okay, what is the influence that crop rotation really has on weed populations? And what they found is that, and this is what I said earlier, is that more complex rotations result in lower total weed density, but greater weed diversity, okay? If you can think of weed populations as simply they're just photosynthetic plants, right? You know, they're going to take the same amount of energy into that system, whether it's allocated to one species or a variety of species. There's only so much of that to go around, okay? So reduced dominance, again, this is what the authors suggest, is the reduced dominance of a narrow range of species, but it promotes the diversity by creating these niches for a wider range of species. Now, I think another example that I'm going to pull up here, same author, just different, whole different study. What he did is he compared a 2-year conventional rotation with a 4-year organic rotation. Okay, and his purposes in doing this were to try to figure out why are we seeing lower weed populations in the organic system. There's a lot of other confounding factors, and he mentions that in this paper. But there's an underlying point here that I think is really beneficial and can allow to tangible management practices, okay? So I'm going to walk through this for a bit. Our 2-year rotation is maize, soybean, okay? And what he's done is he's basically graphically represented every activity that's happened in that field. Herbicide application, tillage, canopy closure. So that's when the crop itself has now become competitive with the weed population. Tillage. And he's done that for each year, okay? And in the case of the 4-year rotation, he's got maize, soybean, then into an oat forage legume, then into a forage legume. And you can start to see some distinct differences between these two. One, there's no herbicide application in here. There's lots of tillage. Why? They're cultivating, they're trying to knock back weed populations. Additionally, in the years 3 and 4, there's a mowing activity, okay? Now, what he did is he took this, and his theory is that if you look at the cumulative impact, so you take everything that's up here and you put it on one bar, it's the cumulative impact. It may not necessarily be 1 year versus the next that is having that drawdown in that weed population over time. Okay? Does that make sense to everyone? It's all of these activities, and that is where you start to construct different rotations. You can start to see all of these different activities that we're doing year in, year out. How are they affecting nutrients? How are they affecting weed populations? Whatever. You pick your example. But it's a cumulative impact. Okay, and I just wanted to bring this up because it's, I find it very interesting, I guess. But it's the type of thing that's very practical. There was some work done in Ontario that looked at the distribution of Chenopodium album, which is lamb's quarters, after certain types of tillage events. And then the distribution within the soil profile went down to 6 inches. 0 to 2, 2 to 4, 4 to 6. They broke it into 2-inch increments. I can't imagine how painful this process must have been to dig up these seeds. But point being, compared a mobile plow to a chisel plow to a no-till system, and you can see the mobile plow does what it does very good. It flips over things and it redistributes that seed within the soil profile fairly evenly, although there's kind of some grouping in the top 2 inches and the bottom 2 inches. When we look at the chisel plow, it leaves obviously the vast majority of that seed in the top 2 inches, right? And a no-till system is kind of the extreme of that, where we see the vast majority of up in the top 2 inches. So here's a question, and I've never heard a bad answer to this. If you have, let's say, an overwintering crop, okay, and you're ready to prepare ground to go into corn or something like that, and you've had a big rain seed shed. You've had overwintering winter annuals that have dumped a lot of seed on the ground. What tool do you use? Do you leave it up the top? Do you bury it? Bury it? Just forget about it for the next 4 years?
Use herbicides.
Spray it out.
That's what everybody else does.
Well, we're talking about seeds, though. So
Yeah,
you've got a problem that you're dealing with, and you've got to. Herbicides aren't going to affect the seeds sitting on the surface right now.
Yeah, but when they germinate, you're going to...
But you got to prepare that ground, right, Chuck? So you've got a choice between one of those two tools. I'll leave it there. I won't even throw out. I've heard some really stupid answers, but
Using herbicides,
well, no, top 3. But
well, that's what people would do.
I know.
There wouldn't be a debate about it. So I mean,
I think there should be a debate about it because I think it's a very tangible thing. If in the case that is lamb's quarters seed lives for a long time, 25 years. So I would rather leave it in the top portion of the seed to germinate it up, burn it off with herbicides, or cultivate the heck out of it. Try to burn that down because you've got a problem you got to deal with. And it's going to be there for 25 years. So do something about it now, rather than give it to your kids. Okay. So just to bring in plant disease into this component, I brought an example. I know, does anyone grow potatoes here? I didn't think so. But there's an example here. There's an underlying theme here that I think is really important. So we hear a lot about the fact that crop rotation can deal with disease management. And I think it's a mixed bag. It really depends. And it has to do with a lot of what the organism or the pathogen that's the problem, right? And the big division can be made here: soil invader versus soil inhabitant. What's a soil, invader? Then I'll yell out once. That's a pathogen that has to have its host there first, because it's not able to survive essentially without its host there. So we come a number of examples, but let's just stick with that. So it has to have its host there, so it's unable to survive outside of that host being present. A soil inhabitant is a plant pathogen that has developed and evolved to be able to survive very extreme conditions: wet, saturated, cold. A good example of that is Verticillium dahliae, which has a huge, wide host range. Okay, and there is a study done, 3 decades ago now, but it puts it nice and clear and present. And they looked at this field over 5 years. They had a relatively high level to start with, okay? But what they did is they went in and planted in part of the field, russet Burbank, a unnamed potato variety that is resistant to verticillium, and then corn, and left it fallow. And what you can see is over a course of time, there's fluctuations, but essentially the corn and the fallow got back to the level that it started with, okay? So that population even though that's a non-host, that population did not die off. But you can see in the russet Burbank, it just skyrocketed because it took advantage of that situation. And I was at a meeting yesterday talking about this, not this specific organism, but it got brought up. A researcher down in Oregon got a phone call from a black raspberry grower, and this is a big deal for black raspberries. It can completely wipe out plantings. And he got a call from a grower saying, "Hey, look, this is a 2-year-old planting. It's done, and it looks like verticillium." And he's complaining because he said, "This was virgin ground. I don't understand what's going on here." And lo and behold, they did some digging around, and it turns out that previously it was in hazelnuts for 25 years. Just prior to that, it was in black raspberries. And so that organism stayed there at some population levels low enough to be there for 25 years, got planted back into black raspberries, and did this. So when we talk about crop rotations benefiting in reducing pathogen populations, it depends, right? That makes sense, everyone? Okay. So I'm going to switch gears here and start talking a little bit about cover crops. And I just threw together this list. This is out of a couple reference materials that kind of outline benefits of crop rotation, the benefits of cover crops. And you can see this list is pretty much identical, with a few, I think one exception, which is the reduced nutrient leaching that falls under cover crops. And there's been a lot of people that have tried to push the envelope on reducing length of crop rotation, in particular production systems, by integrating cover crops into it. And we've been working on that for a couple of years in vegetable production systems, and it's safe to say that though making headway, it's not the same thing in a lot of ways. Time is very important, and so. That being said, I just wanted to there we go. So just to, again, lay some foundation. Are there any questions at this point in crop rotation? I'll kind of tease back on it a little bit. I know you guys have a lot of land pressure on what you can and can't do, but I hope there's some principles and theories in there that you can extrapolate and maybe make some small alterations. I'll bring up a pretty concrete example later. So, okay. So cover crops, another one that obviously it can be very sticky to get into, but just wanted to lay down some foundation before we get into some data, results, and stuff like that. First and foremost, looking at what is your goal in using, trying to identify a proper cover crop. Goal, is it a problem that you're dealing with? Are you dealing with soil erosion, or are you trying to utilize it for a specific use? You're trying to reduce pest pathogens, soil pathogens in the soil. make that division first and foremost. And then identify that place, that time, and that niche where it's going to integrate into that rotation, or sit in that rotation, or where that cover crop has to be at a particular time and place. And then selecting the cover crop, or for that matter, probably selecting a number of different cover crops and trying to, and settling for the best available option. And then the most complicated and most problematic and probably the most artful is the integration of the rotation. Trying to get it, trying to find that niche, and trying to work it into there. Okay, and clearly there's a number of interactions that happen, and I just chose a few here, an example, to talk a little bit about the interaction between what I'll refer to as the cash crop, or the non-cover crop, and cover crops. Nitrogen mobilization is a big one, but I think that's something that we can actually harness and utilize to advantage, and I'll show some research from that. Residue management, dealing with it or utilizing it. In some cases, some production systems that can be used. Pest bridging or breaking, obviously they are plants. They can harbor pest plant pathogens, arthropods, you name it, and that can be a big issue, particularly when you start to think about rotating in and out with maybe a local horticultural grower, horticultural crop grower, and weeds. They can play a massive role a big role in reducing summer and winter annual weeds in that case, and less so much with biennials and perennials. But okay, I know this is probably the most commonly planted cover crop in dairy production in Whatcom, and I just wanted to highlight its attributes real quickly. Cold tolerance. Relatively non-competitive if it's seeded at the right time and at the right stage of corn, and its disease resistance, particularly the tetraploid types. And it should be mentioned, it's still a host. It's just resistant to it. It can deal with the pest pressure, particularly Fusarium, but it still harbors and maintains populations. It just doesn't decline it. So that's something to keep in mind. But think about all this when I start giving out some other examples that we've been working on. Okay, so I'm going to bring up another trial that was done down at WC Puyallup because they've done a lot of work on cover cropping systems down there. And by no stretch of imagination am I trying to promote the use of vetch at all, but not that I am against it, but there's some underlying themes in here that are really important. I think I'll try to tease them out. So these guys looked at, this is Craig Cogger, also looked at pure rye, pure hairy vetch, and then 3 different mixes of those two. 30% rye, 40% rye, 50% rye, and then of course the rest is vetch. And then 2 different planting dates. So the factor of planting date, mid-September, early October. Okay?
This is cereal rye.
This is cereal rye, yes, thanks. And then 2 termination dates, late March and late April. So we've got 2 different planting dates, 2 different termination dates, okay? And then a whole lot of different mixes in between. Okay, so what we're going to look at here is, this is kind of what they found is, we're looking at the carbon to nitrogen ratio. This is averaged over the course of 3 years of results. And, and what we're looking at, again, is carbon to nitrogen ratio. And then we've got our percent rye across the bottom here. This is pure vetch. We've got our mixes in here somewhere, and then pure rye. And then each of these lines represent the different planting or harvest dates, or combination thereof. And what we can see is that as we get it, and there's a general trend here, right? More vetch, early termination dates decreases the C to N ratio. So what would that do? Once incorporated, what's that going to do? Thanks, Chris. Can you say it louder?
Nitrogen.
Yeah, it's going to release it, but it's going to release it relatively quickly, right? Okay. So, again, October planting date, September planting date, but late harvest. Higher C to N ratio as we get into this compared to the earlier harvest. So this is obvious, right? You terminate that cover crop at particularly a rye at a smaller stage. It's more vegetative. It has much more. It's going to break down a lot quicker. Okay. Pure veg and other termination blends should be net supply. This is Craig recommending this. Pure suppliers in the short run. So basically anything below this level is going to be a relatively quick burst of nitrogen. Okay. Now we're talking about in our early termination dates, we're talking about it was late March. Okay. So that nitrogen is going to be available when we want it or not. Depends, of course. But let's use corn as an example. It's going to be way too early, right? We're going to get this flush of nitrogen in the system. We're not going to be able to really utilize it. Later termination, so when we get into this area, we're starting to slowly release that nitrogen. So one of the things that I take away from this is that if you're utilizing an overwintering cover crop, you've got to think about the length between planting and when that's terminated and how that's going to affect, particularly when it's terminated, is how it's going to affect when that nitrogen is going to become available. Is it going to be completely mistimed? Okay, and I know there's a lot of environmental effects that play into that, but generally speaking, you can somewhat target that, and I'll show you that here in the next slide.
What if you harvest that? What would that do to the?
Well, you're taking it all off of there. All right. So if you chop that and get it out of there, I mean, there'll be still some left, but not to the degree that we're looking at here.
The protein levels would be higher in the veg, presumably.
Later on?
For feed, no, for the feed value of that cover crop.
Repeat that again, so I didn't get that.
The protein levels would be higher in veg compared to the ryegrass. The question, when you say utilize, you're saying to till it in and utilize it for a nitrogen source in the future, where most of our dairy producers are looking at for
Chopping
feed value
Yep.
and utilizing it through the cow.
Yeah, I'm laying a principle out here. I'm not going to start planting vetch or anything like that. I'm just, and I'll get to that because there is another factor, and I do realize that sometimes it gets tilled in. So, okay. So now we're looking at fall nitrogen uptake, spring or summer nitrogen release. Okay, and now we've just simply drawn a line across the planting dates, and again across the different blends. And what we can see on the left-hand graph is essentially that earlier planting date resulted in a considerable amount of nitrogen uptake, so much so that it almost didn't matter what blend you used. This is really surprising to me because you think of rye, rye as just a sink for nitrogen, and it's so dependent on when it's planted, okay? And that goes for ryegrass for that matter. I know it's planted a lot earlier, but even when we have 100% rye, we're getting less nitrogen uptake than pure vetch at that later planting date. And this, of course, is average across years, so we've got some control in that. So this is suggestive that planting date is obviously very important for a fall cover crop in terms of nitrogen management. When we look at nitrogen release the following June, so this is mid-June, this would be a usable time period to try to utilize that nitrogen use. Excuse me. We can see there's a general downgrade slope towards, as we get into rye, regardless of planting date, that higher C to N ratio is going to slow that nitrogen release, okay? Now, what it's done is, what this is suggestive of is if you get into a field in the scenario of planting later and you know that you want to release that nitrogen, you may have to push that rye a little bit further than you would want in this scenario, push that cover crop a little bit further to try to get that better vegetative growth and more nitrogen available. Does that make sense, everyone? Principles theory here. Okay. Okay, so I've only got a couple more slides. Well, about 6 more slides. So I want to show some work that we did. We started last fall and it's ongoing, and I think it's highly relevant to this group. So what we did is we had a silage corn variety trial down at WC Mount Vernon, and we've got a number of different varieties in there. But what we did on top of this is we took each variety and we split it in half. We took half the plot and we took pre-sidedress nitrogen tests, had them analyzed, and then applied nitrogen based on that test. And then just as a comparison, we did a 2x rate, okay? So we've got our 75 pounds of N at side dress and 150 pounds of N at side dress. And then on top of that, planted at the 6-leaf stage, we came in and put in a couple different cover crops to compare them to ryegrass to see if we could find something that is working, that could work as well. And these two, I'll show you here in a little bit. These are cereal rye, and we've been using them in other production systems, and they produce a ton of biomass. I mean, they're up and above your head. Chris saw them last summer. And they have other attributes that are very nice, very cold tolerant. They are not resistant to fusarium. Any of that issue's not there. But the other thing is particularly a rootstock, which is a named variety of a rye, does not head out very early. It produces this head, but it will not mature till late June, I think, mid-June. So it produces all this biomass, but it doesn't actually get its form its head at that point. And of course, we compared these to no bare ground soil. These are just these are completely unrelated plots. Just to give you an idea, it's a little bit hard to see here, but this is probably about 7 feet high at this point. You know, big burly biomass. You know, can we utilize that for chopping in the spring? You know, as part of overwintering cover crop, interseeded. Oh, I should mention these. I think I mentioned that these were all interseeded at the 6-leaf stage, so as late as we possibly could get it in there, based on previous research. Okay, so let's look at our biomass, and we started taking these in November every month up till 2 weeks ago now. So I haven't run the statistics on this, but this gives you a general idea. But you can see in the dotted line are the PSNT plots, and then the full standard, so 2x rate, are the full nitrogen, side dress nitrogen. And we can see here's our tetraploid ryegrass, and here are our rootstock rye, which is here, and then our common rye, which is here. And they're probably up to about here now on me. I mean, they're producing a lot of biomass, and we'll see if that, you know, if we get the same results that we've had for the past couple of years in terms of tonnage per acre. But I think these guys they may fit well as a potential substitute for ryegrass. Just through this out also, we take basically monthly soil tests, and we're looking at nitrogen in that system, and there's 2 natural divisions here. Obviously, in that standard plot where we side dress a lot more nitrogen, they all started up much higher as compared to where we applied much less nitrogen at side dress. And you can see that, you know, some of the research has suggested that this is kind of a cutoff where you've got a lot of excess nitrogen. You're ranked high. And this is after corn harvest, keep in mind. And here are our PSNT plots, and then these are our full standard rates. You can see all of them have gotten down below 15 at this point. But what we are seeing is also a natural division between here's ryegrass, which fairly closely followed the bare ground plots, whereas the 2 rootstock and common rye really started sucking up nitrogen and maintained. So what I'm getting at is that these 2 rootstock and common rye, I think, have some potential. We've got to try a couple things out. I want to adjust some seeding rates, but they're really good at removing nitrogen from the system, and they're also really good at producing biomass. Question is what's the spring forage quality like? And that's where the rubber will hit the road. But the other thing that's nice about them is because they produce so much biomass, and I've heard some complaints around ryegrass with the corn stubble getting in the way, you're working with a lot more, so you may be able to chop higher and still get as much biomass out of it and leave some on the ground. So anyways, any questions on that?
Are you doing feed value on?
We will, yeah. We'll do that monthly, Chris, starting in March, just to get an idea.
I just throw that out there for funding in case that's needed.
Is there any effect on the corn crop?
No.
Okay, what was that like?
What was that like?
What was the corn crop like?
Down there? It was great. It was,
Well, 75 pounds of nitrogen at PSNT is a pretty healthy application too. I mean,
that's based on the book.
well, it must have been a pretty low.
It was.
Yeah. I mean, you're not getting a lot of manure on it.
There's no manure.
This is a non-manure. I mean, this is very atypical.
That hasn't been manured in
Right.
probably 100 years. You know, I don't know. Maybe.
So
it
I
has.
mean, that's what I'm saying.
Yeah, but
I don't know how you got 75.
but keep in mind we're dishing out the same amount of N. You know, at the end of the day, that's the goal. So. Any other questions, comments on that? Yeah.
Has there been any comparison to some parts of the United States where they use radish for cover crop?
Like tillage radish?
Yeah,
In terms of what?
well, just the weed pressure and so forth. Has there been any study in on that?
In terms of weed pressure?
Yeah, and
Oh,
what we're
yeah.
talking about
Yeah.
as a cover crop. There's,
Oh yeah. I could spend all day talking about that. We've screened over like 75 different cover crops in Western Washington. One of which is tillage radish. Actually, there were 2 different types of tillage radish. Some other brassicas. You know, a whole bunch of summer.
so how far down the list of the 75? Would it be at 30?
The tillage radish.
Yeah.
You know, I actually was pretty surprised. I planted in Whatcom County last winter, and it survived. I didn't think it was going to make it, and there was a hard freeze at one point. This is a couple years ago, and it survived, and you know, it produced a taproot about this deep, for better or worse. Because if you don't do something with that, you now have, and you till that, you now just reproduced it. So, but it has done well. The other one I'm a big fan of is rapeseed. It does very well with outcompeting weeds, and post incorporation, like if you till it in, it actually suppresses weeds for about 30 days from emerging. You have bare ground for 30 days. It's pretty cool.
Is that a problem in our area too with the crucifer seed?
Yeah. Oh, unfortunately, you can produce it. You can seed brassicas here. They just have to be blackleg and black rod free. And to do that, you have to get it tested. It's about $70. So.
It doesn't have anything to do with the pollination.
No, that's a seed-borne pathogen that actually comes in on the seed,
Okay.
and then it gets carried, I guess.
Okay.
Okay, I'm running out of time. So, we got to 1:30, right? Okay. So let's just. I'm going to briefly talk about a couple different production examples that we started playing around with about a year ago, and I think that have a lot of potential. Interseeding soybeans into corn, and then some perennial wheat. And we're not talking, well, partially talking about perennial wheat for grain production. But so last summer, well, a year and a half ago now, a colleague of mine in the Columbia Basin called me and asked me if I wanted to plant some soybeans to try them out. And I said, "Do you know where we are? You know, they're not going to do very well here." So he said, no, just try a couple. So, and I actually, I was very, very reluctant to plant these, but we did anyways. And we put out a variety trial on kind of the left-hand side of the page is soybean type varieties that are bred to produce, you know, the pod. And on the right-hand side is, these are a number of different forage soybean types. I think this is where we've got some potential promise here. The really interesting thing about forage soybeans is their protein content is completely unrelated to the pod itself. The protein content is present all throughout the plant. So if you cut it, you know, this high, you're going to get that much. You're still going to get protein, you know. So the idea is to interseed this into corn at planting, and you know, there's a lot of work that's got to be done around fertility, around seeding rates. But I will say this, I was pleasantly surprised. We did not compromise corn yield when we compared it. And it also looked really nice. It had a nice understory. And when you go in to chop it, you're just simply chopping everything. And you're commingling it. Now, we haven't done, the forage analysis hasn't been done yet. But the theory is, this is done a lot in the southeastern United States, and the theory is that in some years you may take a slight bump in the overall yield, but you're making it up in quality, okay? And you're getting that good protein source out of the soybeans. And these guys, they're really nice. They'll actually grow up around the corn plant. It works fairly well, and they're very shade tolerant. Any questions on that? Just something we're going to get.
So we can get the Roundup Ready variety from...
That is Roundup Ready. That is Roundup Ready. Why do you think there's no weeds in there?
What's the percentage of loss of that stem when it's grown,
Percentage of loss of that stem.
that you leave
I'm not understanding.
on the soybean in the corn? It goes out in between the row,
Yeah.
and it lays down, and that, you can't get that with a truck.
Yes. I should have explained that further. First of all, these are, in this particular situation, these were not seated on top of each other, okay? So we seated it like this, okay? The forage types do not lay down. They're upright. And so when you go to cut it, it's almost like a bush bean, if you imagine that, like a pole bean or a bush bean, you know? And it sits very upright. And when you go to cut it, it doesn't fall down. And we didn't have any problem cutting this. It went right in. I mean, there's definitely plant material left there, you know. Yeah.
But if you plant that in your cornfield, it's gonna be in the shade, then it ain't gonna grow.
It was planted in the cornfield.
Not the bottom one. Yeah, but that corn ain't even half grown yet.
I can promise you that it looked just fine.
I mean, soybeans are heat.
Yes, they are. And that's why we planted corn north-south,
Yeah.
and soybeans are planted east-west. So you get sunlight as the day goes on down those alleyways.
The reason they planted it was for more yield?
No, for yield quality.
And so what does a soybean do in the wintertime for the ground?
Oh, it will not overwinter.
I'm just saying, what are the residual nitrate levels like in those fields, though?
It will, especially in wet ground, like now, forget about it. There's nothing there.
So what does it do to the nitrogen, like you put cover crops for nitrogen?
Great question. We're just trying everything out we can, you know. I mean, and this is one tool of a million. You know, if we can get, a couple percentage bump in quality yield, I'll be happy with it.
Have you ever planted vetch with corn?
No, I've heard vetch is a weed, not something you plant. I'm joking.
It's a high protein.
It's a good question. Yeah,
It'll climb with the corn.
we have interseeded vetch into corn, and it does pretty well, but you got to get it at a very particular stage, otherwise it just becomes leggy and doesn't do anything.
So what about the soybean that you planted with the corn? What's the stage of maturity when you're harvesting the corn?
Hey, stage of maturity harvesting.
When you're harvesting the corn and you're taking the soybean too, is the soybean, is it seeding out at all, or?
With the forage varieties, you don't care about that.
It doesn't seed out?
Nope. These have not been bred for Western Washington. What we want to the plants are about this big, and they got to that stage, probably late August, and that was it. But they were there, and we got 75% of them when we cut it. And that's been fed right into this. It's already commingled, mixing it. I don't know. This is just an idea that we're playing around.
What's the quality of it like? I mean, the plant itself, is it?
It's not weird looking. Is that what you're saying?
Is it slimy? Does it start to break?
No.
This is.
Granted,
it's down there in the
Chuck,
shade.
You're asking me after we had one of the driest, warmest falls ever. I mean.
Right. I remember we tried to grow fava beans here once as a forage crop. It was one time something was experimented with. The quality just wasn't.
Well, the thing that makes this unique amongst these are Roundup Ready. So, it fits into the system. The question is seeding rate, fertility, that got all brought up. But, we'll try to dial that in this year. And
Of course, from our environmental side, those fields are still going to be bare. You're going to have to plant. What's the nitrogen level like in those fields? I would think that it'd be pretty high.
Maybe
residual nitrogen.
In the bare, was there enough residual on the leaves that you left to have cover.
There's stuff there, but you know,
So if we didn't have to plant the relay crop, because there wasn't enough leaf cover to keep the rain from smashing down.
it's a good question. And could you, you know, no one wants to do this, but could you post-harvest seed too? You know, I mean, there's that option.
I'm saying if we have enough residual from those plant biomass, is that gonna hold the soil?
It's, you know, I don't know if you've ever taken a bean leaf. You can,
Yes.
it blows in the wind. I mean, it's a
It
type of
breaks
thing.
down pretty fast.
Yeah, there's not much there. I won't lie to you. Okay, one last thing, one last example. Yeah.
So you're saying you harvest this, if we try that soy, you harvest it at the same time as the corn, just chop the head.
You don't even, you pretend like that soybean's
Yeah,
not
you
even
just
there.
chop it right up just like
Yeah.
the beans.
Yeah.
And then basically though, you're gonna have to go over, presumably, just get down to plant a cover crop.
If you wanted to,
Yeah,
yeah.
all three of them there.
Yeah, if you want to get real crazy, yeah.
That makes sense.
Or you could just, I mean, with rye, that example I showed with that rye, you can just broadcast seed that. That stuff will sit on the surface and germinate.
So you could, but we could, essentially what you just said is you could triple crop in one season.
I don't know if the values are there.
I'm just thinking.
Potentially.
Because it's just the relay crops are, you know, around here at fall, sometimes you try to plant it and it doesn't turn out.
Yeah.
So that's what's nice about relay crops. They're
Yeah.
in and they're
Yeah,
established.
you know that yep. Okay, so one last kind of example that I just kind of throwing out here. I think this is pretty exciting. Steve Jones and I just got some money to fund a graduate student to work on this. He's been playing with this for 20 years in the Palouse, as you can see, trying to develop a perennial wheat system. And he's held on to these genetics, and I think he realized about a year and a half ago that, you know what, this could fit into a forage system. Okay, and here's how he's envisioning this playing out. I'd actually like to get him up here to talk about that particularly. But what you can see here is this is a traditional wheat variety here in the middle. And this is the perennial lines. They're regrowing after harvest. And what Steve is envisioning is this, is that there's two routes. These are onless varieties. There's two routes to go down here. One is plant in the fall. It's false planted wheat. You could spring chop it just like you do ryegrass. And you can do it more than once because it's just going to keep regrowing, particularly in the summertime. You could shut off that chopping at some point and then combine it. It might be a little bit later. The yields might be down. The other option is to just let it go to, like you normally would with wheat, combine it. And then he's estimated that you get about 10 to 15 tons of straw off of this because this plant is enormous. It's 6.5 feet tall. Now, it might be hard to get your combine up there, but the idea is that the other option is, and that's what I think is the next slide. Yeah, here we go. This is this is regrowth that happened last year after wheat harvest. And Steve's also thinking that maybe this can be fall foraged or fall chopped. Okay, so the plant has been combined. And can you take off this plant material or feed it? So again, the two kind of options that are happening, or theoretically happening here. One is fall planted. It can be chopped in the spring, and then actually let this go to head and take that off the grain off of it, or you can let it take the grain off and then fall foraged afterwards. So just something interesting. You want me to?
This is perennial, right?
It's perennial.
So you plant it in the fall and then it goes on for years.
Theoretically. The other, oh, I forgot to mention this. This is the other thing. He has found that the root system on these things are enormous. And so he's thinking that it's going to be very effective at mining nutrients deep down in the soil profile, which could bring about other benefits. But theoretically, yes. Yeah. I mean, he's been trying to develop this, in the Palouse system for years, and I don't think I'm not sure the yield matched with that system. I'm not sure.
What kind of yields did you get here?
Out of this? These are his slides. In terms of grain?
Yeah, like 60 bushels, 50 bushels.
Oh, I think he said actually I don't know. Oh, 3 times. Oh, that's a dry matter. Sorry.
Okay.
My guess is it's probably lower. You got to compromise something, right, for all that biomass, and why didn't it get adopted in the Palouse if it would have worked? But a couple, again, just a couple other facts here. Tonnage dry matter is 3 times the wheat of barley. That's that height really that I showed earlier. Feed quality, green shop, I had showed that earlier, is good. The grain protein is comparable to other cereals. And again, going back to that slide I talked about with flexibility and rotation, I think this is the type of crop that has the flexibility to maybe take down different routes and make changes mid-swing in that crop rotation. If you want to take the green chop off and then put it into corn, you can do that. Okay, so one last thing I'll mention is we started a newsletter about a year ago, and I didn't think very many people were going to pay attention to it, but in the past couple of months, it's gotten over 500 people, and I just wanted to point it out. We try to keep, there's at least some dairy-specific article on every issue. It's electronically given out. We cover a variety of different things. We'll have soil management in there, whatever. In fact, Nicole wrote an article last month. If you want to sign up, we don't send out, that listserv is only used for that. But the way it's structured is that it's broken into technical articles. These are written by experts from around the region. And if you want to print it off, you can print it off, and you'll get just that article if you want to. So you can skip over, blueberry root diseases if you don't want to listen to that. But something to check out.